Wonderful. My name is Tim Adams, and I'm the President and CEO of the Institute of International Finance. Let me say it's a real honor to be back here. I think we've attended every single one of these from its inception. And let me say two things before we get started. A shout out to President Tharman, whose inspiring remarks this morning reminded us why he's such an important statesman globally and wows audiences no matter where he is. I've known Tharman a long time, and I'm always inspired by his comments. The other second shout out is to the MAS and to Ravi, who started this 8 or 9 years ago, but is a thought leader in so many topics around the world, whether it's central banking, which is what they do, as well as climate finance, transition finance, but also in terms of technology. So shout out to both Tharman and the MAS for creating such a great institution as this and for all the things they do. Commissioner, it's good to see you again. I always enjoy spending time with you. This morning we got an enthusiastic introduction to this topic from Kristalina Georgieva, and it reminds me of what I hear when I travel around the world, from Sydney to Tokyo, Toronto, London, Brussels. Three things happen. One is the first conversation, especially when the Klieg lights are on, is enormous enthusiasm for this topic. See, central bank digital currencies, transformative. Then the doors close, and the second phenomenon happens, which is, boy, this is hard. There's a sobriety that comes to the conversation, which is, how do we make this work? What are the real design components? What are the legal foundation? What about interoperability? The third component is, everyone recognizes Europe seems to be in the vanguard, the forefront of this topic, which means that everyone's watching you. And I can't tell you how many central bankers or other policymakers around the world will say to me, we're not sure what we're going to do. We're going to put in place the foundations, but we're really watching what's going on in Frankfurt and Brussels and Europe, and what they do will set the stage for the rest of us. So with that as an introduction, why don't we start? And maybe we could just change our aperture a little bit before we dive in, and you can give us your vision of the use case for central bank digital currencies, and then we'll talk about some of the specific design components and the legal aspects.
Well, first of all, it's great to be in Singapore, and honestly, this morning already, we were so energized by the interview, the conversation with President Tharman, and obviously Kristalina Georgieva. I'm not quite so sure that the focus now is on use cases. I think we're actually moving beyond that, because if you saw this morning's presentation, Europe isn't the only jurisdiction that's looking at public money in a digital format, and I think that's where we have to begin this conversation. We're all familiar with cash. Some of you in the room have cash. You've owned up to that. Not everybody. And we want in Europe to make sure that we have choice. And we're thinking, what happens in a time when people are using less cash? So we've done two things, and I think it's really important to stress. One is a proposal, legislation for a digital euro. But at the same time and in the same breath, we've also strengthened the legal tender status of cash, because we know that there are many in society who still want to use cash. So cash has to be acceptable and accessible. So in other words, if I want to do a transaction, that I can use my cash. But clearly the future is digital, and I think this festival is all about what the future can look like. And we have taken a very step-by-step approach in Europe. So the European Commission works with the European Central Bank on a digital euro. Very important, the decision to either launch or not is with the European Central Bank, and they're independent.
Right.
However, for me and for the Commission, it's really important that we have a democratic oversight of this next evolution of money, of public money. And we're doing that because the proposal is out there for discussion with the European Parliament that I once sat in, and also the member states, the ministers of finance. What's been interesting for me is the evolution of how people think about central bank currencies. In the beginning, people said to me, what is it? Why do I need it? I have it on my phone already.
Right.
And then you start talking about public money and private money. And if you go down that way too much, you confuse everybody. But now we have the proposal out, so a legal proposal. I think our finance ministers and the European Parliament are now very focused on what do we want it to deliver, including use cases, but also making sure that the euro is fit for the future. So it's bigger than just use cases are really important, but it's about the bigger picture for the euro as a global currency. Also around how do we strengthen digitalization. One of the things that wasn't mentioned, and I hope we talk about, is cybersecurity. Because I think in all of this conversation about how wonderful the future of digital can be, remember there are those who will use it as a weapon against us. So to come back to the core of your question, the debate is now much more focused on the shape of a digital euro, how does it link with the private sector, the banks. We know that banks are little concerned about what impact it would have on their business model. There is no desire for the European Central Bank, and I think I can say this on their behalf, to become the bank of everybody, right. Not at all. There is no desire from the ECB to know what I'm spending my money on, not at all. So there is a role for the private sector, and they're beginning to look at how can they innovate with a digital euro, a public form of cash in digital format. And I think that when we, rather before the legislation was proposed, there was a more vague conversation, almost saying, why do we need it?
Right. Today,
it's okay, if it's coming, what do we want it to do? And we might also talk about the public attitude towards privacy in Europe, which I think is different and has to be taken account of.
I'm going to come back to privacy in a minute because I think it's a key issue in many jurisdictions, including in the United States. You mentioned the existing financial system, which I represent, and there's discussions about what the design parameters of a new central bank digital currency, wholesale versus retail. How do you speak to, and you're very generous with your time whenever I see you, my industry comes to see you, how do you address their concerns about being displaced or disintermediated given possible design outcomes?
Well, I mean, the first observation is no system can be fossilized. A status quo does not exist. And around money and the financial system, I'm commissioner since 2020, late 2020. There's been enormous change in the entire financial architecture in that short period of time. COVID accelerated digitalization. It accelerated change. Many people who had never used apps or technology just adopted. And sometimes it's almost like it's an osmosis rather than you have to physically sit down and learn. So you'll use what works for you. And we all did that during COVID. And because of that experience, I would say to the financial system, you need to look to your future not as it is today, but as it might evolve. You should look at the opportunities that you can get from the launch, if that is the case, of a digital euro. We do not want to disintermediate. There is a role for the private sector, banking, and perhaps, and indeed in this audience, fintechs, to develop products. So we will, in the legislation, there is the capacity for the ECB to develop tools to perhaps limit the amount of money, central bank money I can hold in my wallet. It won't be interest bearing. So there are a number of different tools to make sure that this becomes complementary, first to cash, but also complementary to whatever other private offers there are already in the marketplace, or indeed that might come.
Right. Part of your remit is financial stability. Is there a financial stability concern? And if so, how do you address that?
Well, once it's in your title, you have to worry about it a lot. I mean, I think there are many issues that we can worry about in terms of financial stability, but it's core to what we're doing around a digital euro. And in fact, I think it would be, if we were having this conversation and we were not looking in detail at how a digital euro might function, I think that would be a more concern for financial stability. I know Libra was mentioned, and I think there is always the case for if the public sector doesn't move, and not rapidly without thought, but if the public sector remains as it is, then private sector can function and might even overtake some of the public goods function, which I think is really, really important when we talk about central banks. So I think there was a real case for us to make sure that we were moving at pace, but with thought, as to how we would roll out and have a conversation around digital euro. I remember having a debate in the European Parliament where our elected members ranged from those who fully understood what it might mean to those who really were beginning to take it on board and those who already made up their mind that they didn't like it.
Right.
And this is really important that we have all of those parts of the conversation. My role, and I think the role for the ECB, is also to make sure that everything we do is mindful of financial stability, because we've lived through times when we did not have financial stability, and that has terrible consequences for societies and families and communities. And I was very struck by the President's comments around, do good. and I would add do good for all.
Right.
It's really important that the previous conversation, I was eavesdropping backstage, was talking about values and doing good. And truly the financial system is the greatest catalyst for change around sustainability, so doing good for climate, environment, and for public. So I think that those who narrowly look at the financial system as being for those in the industry, they're not my friends, because I believe we need to really make the financial system more democratic, much more inclusive. We have millions in Europe that are unbanked. And this is in a developed part of the globe. We had an amazing statistic about the numbers globally that are unbanked. So the financial system is not accessible to all, and it is perhaps inaccessible to those who most need access to finance, even if it is in small number. So rest assured, when it comes to financial stability, working with the banking sector, we want smooth transitions. We do not like abrupt adjustments. But I go back to my comment around the pandemic. Who would have thought going into what was a global crisis, and indeed for many a disaster from the point of view of those who lost their lives because of the pandemic and how it impacted families. But look at what we did in terms of our life and how we changed almost overnight. And those who didn't have good access to broadband tried to find better.
Right.
You know, so I think we have actually, we've leapfrogged in time to a place where, as Kristalina Georgieva said, we're on the high seas now.
Right.
The water didn't look too choppy in that. So I think we have to make sure that if it does come a little bit choppy, that we're ready for it and that we've instruments to deal with it. But of course, it's front and center of our minds.
I'll come back to financial inclusion as well, because I think it's an important policy objective. It's my judgment that a digital euro is going to happen. The question is when and what are the design parameters. Maybe you could walk the audience through what you think the timeline looks like. What is the role of the Commission? What's going on in Brussels, what has to happen after that, and there are EU elections coming up, so there will be a different commission in place starting the second half of next year. How does that affect that timeline?
Okay, so the timeline is as follows. It was really important for me as Commissioner to get the proposal out. So that is now being discussed in the European Parliament, mainly in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, but it's also, and I think really importantly, being discussed within the Finance Ministers grouping, but also in member states. And Europe really only works when we have a bottom-up, inclusive approach. I've said, and I'll repeat it on this big stage, that we are not rushing this. So we are not saying you must hurry up your discussions and your debate. Rather, we're saying take your time to consider everything. You're right to point out that we will have elections to the European Parliament across Europe in June of next year. So it was nice that this proposal is out, that there is no urgency. It may become a topic of conversation in the elections, and if it is, all to the good, because the more tuned in our public are on these developments, the better, in my point of view. And then the future really will depend on the new commission, the incoming commission, which is usually towards the autumn of next year, and then how soon the new parliament settles down. So, as you know, that's one track. Separately, the ECB have moved to the preparation stage.
Right.
And that's another timeline. So we're not talking about next year, for example. I don't want to put a timeline on it because it will go up on X straight away, and I don't want to be the decider of timelines. I think we'll take due time and due process and strong public debate. But here's something that has interested me as I've watched this, because I come to everything with the former journalist mindset, like why are we doing it, who's doing it, what's it about, basic questions that really need to be answered. And I've asked all of those of my services as well. And what that drives us all to do is question how we deal with money today. And one of the things that I saw on screen is the evolution of money is extraordinary. And it's about trust. Because if you don't trust the digital form or the cash form, you know, it's over. So trust is fundamental in the financial system, and that's why I'm very keen that we have strong public debate in our member states about a central bank currency and how it will evolve in the future. Because we saw in the financial crisis how trust was very fragmented. So we're talking about a timeline over, I would say, years, but I don't know how many. But certainly not next year.
Right.
But I think that all of the focus in the beginning was very much questioning why, and now we're looking at the when, which is the question that you've asked. And the fact that we're not alone And one of the arguments I used very early on when colleagues were questioning me about why we're doing this when so many other things might need to be done is because Europe cannot afford to be behind. You very much said in your opening remarks that Europe is being looked at as to what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I would like to think that the strong message that I'm trying to deliver is we're doing it very openly, inclusively, and we want strong public debate. We want people to ask questions about the how and the why, so that we get acceptance of this. And one of the issues which I see happening, I see it even in my own behavior, so I didn't use cash because I couldn't during COVID, but I have a little bit of cash now, and I see that in times where there's cost of living difficulties or crisis for some families and communities, cash is a very strong budgeting tool for many families. So I always insist that we talk about choice, not one or the other, and that if it goes towards increased digitalization, it is the choice of people that drives that rather than the system insisting on it. And there is a very big difference.
Let's agree that it's going to happen. You're going to be a laboratory for the rest of the world. Therefore, interoperability with other jurisdictions is key. How do you think about that as you're looking at the legal foundations as well as the design parameters?
Yeah. Well, I have to say we're also looking at the rest of the world and what we do, so we don't kind of blindly do our own thing. And I think that's why I'm here, is also to learn from others as to what happens. So there's some different experiences of launching central bank currencies. And there's no pathway to watch because it's a first. Yeah. And everything that you launch when it's a first has different outcomes. We want to make sure that they're all good outcomes around inclusion, for example, around what technologies are used, around accessibility for those who find the system inaccessible rather today. So there'll be lots of discussion around the design features. I think at the bigger level, though, and we haven't really addressed that, is the role of central banks, monetary policy, the anchoring of having this public good and trust, which I've mentioned already. So I think all of these components drive not only the conversation, but also how this will, if the ECB decide to roll out, I like your prediction that it's going to happen. I'm not saying that, but I think all of the signals would suggest that central banks globally are also looking at this from the perspective of their role in monetary policy and their sense that digitalization is the future. And therefore, we will, and I hope people will read the tea leaves, we are doing this in a very open and inclusive way, and we want the hard questions to come to us so that we can be very strong in our communication with the public. But I do see a public that's now beginning to think about money. Right. I have these interesting conversations with older people, and I really liked the discussions around living and learning. But we have young children now who've never physically handled money, and I gather some grandparents are physically showing them this is cash. And isn't it interesting to try and consider what that might mean if you've never handled physical cash as a child, and how what will your relationship be with money? Right. And I think these are questions, from a sociological point of view, that we do need to think about. And because I'm very much motivated by the power of the financial system to do change for good for all, I would always add that, I do think we need to understand that as we move from physical, perhaps, to more digital, how does that change our relationship with money? Right. And I don't think we're sure of what that means yet, but I think we need to ask those questions.
There is a generational issue. For example, we know, and we've seen in Spain, our institutions shut down their branches only to be forced to reopen them. Italy, there's a discussion. Germany, there's a discussion. Some of this for cost savings, but there's a generation that says, I like my branch. I like the physical aspects. So you have to consider that there's still a generation that's not quite digital native yet. How do you bridge those two?
But I don't think there's one or two of these generations, because my capacity with technology at a certain age may not be the same as I get older. It may be better, but it may not be. I think we cannot lose that the financial system has to have people at its center. What else is it for? I mean, why are we doing all of this structure if it's not about people? I always insist on saying that when you have very little funds, the most difficult thing is to get access to funds. And yet when you have a lot of funds, you can get more. So I think we do need to think about the role of the financial system and financial architecture in society. So you're right that even the member state I know best, there was some attempts to close a lot of branches. That didn't go down well.
Right.
So a reversal of a decision. But younger people have less, I suppose, need sometimes to find physical infrastructure. But I don't think you can say that that will be how they will always feel. Many of you will have been on the end of a phone line. We've all for hours sometimes, trying to get access to a real person to talk to. And I think my big message for financial services is it's about service. So we will have AI that will do lots of things, and this is wonderful. But as the President said, you know, a human contact, human-centric, ethical financial system has to be at the core, regardless of whether we digitalize rapidly or at slower pace. And I think to some extent we in COVID didn't have that because we couldn't quite have that physical, so we went quite digital. And now we're beginning to think, well, we need to make sure that it isn't one or the other, that we have choice.
We've got great questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to get to your questions. Let me just get one more in on financial inclusion. You mentioned several times it's a theme we've heard throughout the day and throughout the week, and I think rightfully so, as you know, putting people at the center. So what is the ideal state? When this is done in Europe, what is the ideal state for financial inclusion look like? And then what are you doing now to ensure that ideal state exists?
Well, I keep talking about financial inclusion, financial literacy, or being money savvy. Now, I don't want us all to be experts because I frankly don't know all of the nuts and bolts of the financial system, but I want it to work for people. And I want to make sure that as we grow up, and I think this is a really important conversation in Europe at the moment, that we have a society that has the confidence to ask the right questions.
Right.
And we have a financial system that might take a look inwards and say, where are we building barriers, even if they're invisible, for people to have the confidence to ask the right questions? And in that vein, then, it does mean that we have to have access to individuals within the financial system. So if you like, my vision is to break down the barriers. So when I come into this role, we have many acronyms, we have lots of structures, and we have, as all sectors tend to have, we hide behind them sometimes. We have to come out from behind that, particularly in a digital world, and make sure, as was mentioned in the previous panel, that money becomes important at all stages of our lives. That we know for women, pensions provision is not sufficient.
Right.
We know that for vulnerable households, it's difficult to think about saving. It's also the case that vulnerable households tend to pay higher to have access to credit. And these are things that the financial system can do better on. And if we can improve those things, not only do you improve it for the individual, the family, but society benefits. And here's the thing that really motivates me. You know, mental health issues arise if you have financial stresses and strains, and we saw that very clearly during financial crash. Your health, your physical health is impacted also. So, you know, while we talk here about, you know, big finance and digitalization, to me, very backbone of a society that functions is a strong financial system that's integrated, that's accessible, and that we all talk about why it's accessible, not just in times of need, but we understand that at all times during our life cycle, we will have encounters with the financial system, but that we should feel in control of those encounters, including, and this is a big topic, not for now, control of our own data.
Right.
When it comes to this digitalization, maybe more access, if you get more data into the system, to better financial services, but always with the person, the individual, controlling their data.
I would love to talk about data as well. There's a great question up here about will CBDC dethrone stablecoins? And I would ask generally about stablecoins. I know in the U.S. we're really struggling with creating the legal and policy foundation for crypto assets and for stablecoins. There's a real debate, a lack of guidance. So how are you treating that in the Commission? And what do you think about the question, CBDCs dethroning stablecoins?
Well, that wouldn't be the motivation, but certainly in the beginning there was an anxiety around what would happen if private sector evolved. What we've done in Europe is we have our markets and crypto assets legislation. So, I mean, you had three choices really. You could either try and ban them, you could ignore them, or you could regulate. And I think we've done the right thing in terms of regulation. And we've also, other jurisdictions are looking at what we're doing. So the dethroning or whatever, I think this is, again, how do you complement or replace? And it's about choice here. I think what the reason and the whole focus around the public money, the central bank digital euro, again, it's about the role of central banks. It's about the future proofing of the euro. It's providing for the public a choice, a physical cash or a digital cash. And it also gives people options for online and offline payments. I mean, so I think that it answers lots of questions for society and for citizens. But it isn't designed with dethroning or otherwise. And I do think that in terms of the whole digitalization space, I mean, this room and this exhibition that we will hopefully see is about fintech's future focused. And I'm sure those will drive change. But we also have to make sure that we regulate effectively. And we've done that with our markets and crypto assets. We will have legislation around the digital euro. Again, we want to make sure that there is democratic oversight. And I was very taken by President Tarman's concerns around AI and democracy. But that's a discussion for a whole other day, but important to raise.
We're going to find out more about that next year. Half the world's population go to the ballot box next year, and the odds that AI will affect the outcome of some of those elections are certainly non-trivial. Yeah. Let me bring up the issue of privacy, and we hear it from libertarian movements, certainly U.S. and the U.K. and other, even emerging in Europe, a strange connection with the anti-vaxxing movement, anti-CBDCs. In fact, in the state of Florida, the current governor, who's a presidential aspirant, they've passed laws to prevent a CBDC over concerns about privacy. How do you address privacy concerns?
Well, it's a huge issue, and rightly so. In Europe, we have very strong views on privacy issues. So we have our GDPR. I think I referenced in my early remarks of the view of the ECB respecting their independence, but they have no desire to know what I'm spending my money on. We already, when we use our payment system, we can see already where we're spending money on. But I think that we have to be mindful that there are some in society who believe the worst and cannot be persuaded otherwise. We need to make sure that the conversation doesn't focus only on that narrow view, but rather takes a wider view of why central banks are looking at this, how they're designing them, and reassure citizens and society that there is not any intention whatsoever to invade, because it's about my privacy as well. I care about my privacy very much.
Of course.
And therefore we need, and have had already very good debates in Parliament around this topic. But I'm a great believer in, rather than trying to dismiss issues, you need to debate them, which goes back to my point around timelines. No hurry here. Listen to everyone's concerns, and in fact reassure them that this is about ensuring that there's privacy in the very design of a central bank digital euro, rather than the view that this is about Big Brother. And I think I used that expression in one of the debates I took. I said, look, hold on here. This is not about Big Brother. This is about making sure that our financial system, that the public money, the public good that is in central bank money, is maintained and enhanced in a digital era, while also ensuring that those who want can use cash, and that money cash is accepted. Quite interesting what's happened in Sweden, because they were very advanced digitally.
Indeed.
And when the discussion came into Parliament and into their committee, there was a bit more caution. And I think that's really interesting to observe. And also a view that, in fact, cash should be accepted, particularly around food. So if you're buying food, it should absolutely be accepted in those cases. and for pharmaceutical products. So I think the debate has evolved, and it goes to your point of the very different views on the spectrum. But I would like to think that our timelines allow for a deeper understanding, a deeper debate, an answering of questions several times, because I think that's very, very important, so that we allay those who have genuine concerns. I think there will always be people who have their mind made up already and it's closed.
Right.
And I think we're not really trying to, I would love to think I could open their minds. I don't think that's possible, but I think there's a much broader view in society that just want to be informed fully, and we're part of that process.
Cybersecurity, you mentioned the advent, the rapid progress of quantum computing, which puts all of our systems in peril in just a few short years. How does that play into the way you think about legislating, writing laws, and the design parameters?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things, it really keeps me awake at night, because the title of financial stability, and we do know that already the financial system gets attacked all the time, even as I speak. But I do worry about, you know, a significant attack. We had one over the weekend, which was quite dramatic, and how that might destabilize societies. So I think that we need to think and constantly invest in resilience. So we have a piece of legislation, Digital Operational Resilience Act. We are now insisting that all of those in this space constantly look at where the vulnerabilities are, address them before somebody else gets a foothold in there. And I suppose what I was quite taken again by the excellent conversations this morning is, how do we keep the human capacity, the human input into all of this if and when something terrible happens? What would it mean? What's our backup in our financial system if or when this happens? And we can only answer those in collaboration with our financial system. And I talk all the time to fintechs, banking, and this is the area where we are all vulnerable. But it's not only the financial system. I mean, we've seen attacks on healthcare systems. Right. So there are bad actors out there, including at the geopolitical level, who would like to cobble, if you like, many of us. And therefore, on this area of resilience, we have to be, it's not resilience now, it's resilience all the time. So it's not something that we can take our eye off. We have to build this and factor it into more of our planning, because if we become more and more digital, then this becomes much more extreme should there be a successful hit on the financial system. And then I do think we need also to have institutional memory. I always think that's really important. Yeah. I like that in the earlier conversations, so that, and I'm probably part of that bit of the memory piece because I've lived this long, so that you do have people who can see and if you like, navigate the where we were and the where we are. And that we input those into the conversation. Because again, and this I come back to the word trust, if we have an attack on our system, which not only destabilizes the system, it also will break trust. And that's very hard to rebuild, as the financial industry have discovered when there are crises. So these things are front and center of our minds at all times.
I think ending on the concept of the importance and centrality of trust is a good way to wrap this up. Okay. Commissioner, I'm so glad you're in your job. You're doing a fabulous job. Thank you for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner McGuinness, please.
Thank you.